Good evening, everyone, and welcome to lecture number 2, using perspective as a skill of influence. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is we've certainly been exploring empathy. You folks have read quite a bit of articles and watched some videos on the concept of empathy and perspective taking. And tonight, what I want to do is start to talk about, and I introduced this in last week's module, but we want to introduce the concept of using perspective taking and using empathy as, and transitioning that into using it to influence outcomes in terms of trying to get either an outcome with respect to a negotiation or a conflict that is the outcome you desire. And when we get back to what I spoke about last week, this is a slide from last week, when we talk about getting the outcome you want, those were generally my 4 categories that I used last week. And when we talk about using empathy, oftentimes people, in perspective taking, oftentimes people resist it. They feel as though it's not right to try to talk about emotion, understand emotion that somebody else is feeling, and then try to use that emotion to gain an outcome that's beneficial for them. And so really where the conflict arises is, we want to be influencers, right? We want people to get to the ultimate decision about a conflict or a negotiation, influencing them so that not only do you get what you want, but it is actually beneficial to them. It is a negotiation and it is an outcome that is also good for them. We're not using empathy or perspective taking to be manipulative. We're not trying to play with their emotions or abuse their emotions or use this connection that we may be able to create in any kind of a underhanded way. All right, so this is all so that ultimately we can use their perspectives and understand what emotional connection they may have to the conflict or to the negotiation, and then try to decipher or determine ways where we can influence them to ultimately get to a point where we have a successful negotiation and it's a good place for them and it's a good place for where we want to be. So when we look at, again, why aren't we more compassionate, why aren't we more empathetic, there's reasons why, because when you look at the social neurosciences, Don Groman talked about when we explored his video at the beginning, first module, he basically identified, or social science has identified, that if a person is in need, if a person is suffering, we're all hardwired to try to help. So, if that's our initial place, then, the question, and this is often sort of what novices to negotiations believe, or even if you're not novice, again, I know many attorneys who've been negotiating for years and years, and they may not be novices in negotiation. It may simply be that they do not feel that, employing compassion, employing empathy and perspective taking is anything that they should be doing when their ultimate goal is to get a deal that is beneficial to them. And so, what they're really basically saying is that when you're negotiating, a negotiator essentially needs to be absorbed in their self-interest. Perhaps they're not rushing past, somebody laying on the street, but it is essentially the same sort of thought process that, we need to be absorbed with what our goal is, getting to where we want to go. And good negotiators don't stop and, help, or don't stop and take the perspective or consider the perspective of, the person in the street. So, similarly, when, he spoke of and talked about his brother-in-law who interviewed the Santa Cruz Strangler, the man basically said if he experienced his empathy towards victims, he said, of course not. If I felt their distress, I could not have done what I've done. I have to turn that part off in order to do that. And so many people, and it's evolving now, but a lot of negotiators, again, feel like in order to get what their desired outcome is, that they need to turn off that part of them and not consider the perspectives and not consider the empathy or the emotional connection that somebody has to a negotiation, but instead just really needs to be, like I say, basically self-absorbed and turning that that part of them off in order to pursue the deal or the resolution to the concept or the conflict that they're seeking. And so what we first want to do is in my mind, when we kind of consider the process, first we want to look at the process of leadership. Starting point for getting people in a negotiation is to believe what you believe. And that's really what you want, right? Your outcome is this. You believe it's the right outcome. And it's generally also thinking it's the right outcome for the other side, or at least it certainly is within reason a good outcome for the other side. So you need to have conviction that you have insight to correct an unresolved issue, whether it's an issue involving a client, involving a family member, coworker, a friend, roommate. You have to believe you have that kind of insight and that you have the kind of leadership that you can get them to believe what you believe and that they will be better off for it, right? Particularly, when we think this, particularly at this week, is particularly when we think of a leadership model, is keeping in mind Martin Luther King, right? I have a dream that one day down in Alabama with its vicious racists and its governor having lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right here in Alabama, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. And, very controversial at the time, given the racial divide that existed in the 1960s in the United States. But he believed this wholeheartedly, and he was leading the country and believing that this vision that he had was the vision that we should all follow. And so, he wasn't thinking about collaboration. He wasn't thinking about perhaps he needs to make some concessions or how do we compromise to get, a better way of life. He's full on going full force with his vision that he believes in. And in fact, he goes on to say, it's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. And so we have come to cash this check, a check that we give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We also have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. So again, as a leader, he is not open to, let's do this gradually. Let's be open to compromise. So this is what leadership is all about, is having a vision, having a conviction, believing what you believe, and then, trying to make sure and that it really is a vision that other people should follow. Martin Luther King had no doubt that this vision was the right vision and that there should be followers and that the people at that point in time were up to following him. And so as leaders, that's what we need to think about when we're in a negotiation or we're in some sort of a conflict situation, that we can garner the information, we can do what we need to do, and come to a vision of what is right in that particular situation, and then set out to get people to believe in that vision, in that outcome. It's the outcome you want, it's the outcome you desire, but it's not, necessarily a selfish outcome. It's the one that you believe is right for the situation. So, when we think now about the process of influence, creating trust, starts first with seeking to understand, engaging in empathy, active listening in order to create a solution that meets your needs and the specific needs of the person with whom you're negotiating. Utilizing relational skills means keeping the process dynamic, keeping the process fluid. So you're always asserting a position, but listening, taking perspective, using empathy, then further consideration, and then asserting again. So it's a very dynamic and a very fluid process. Creating a BATNA, and sometimes a worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, you need to have the ability to be assertive, but a reminder, the purpose of doing this analysis is to help you make informed decisions about the possible options for a resolution or a deal, and it creates the ability to be assertive. Now, for those of you who may not necessarily be, convinced yet, who may be thinking that, you're still unsure about using empathy and perspective taking as a tool of influence, and we much prefer instead to collaborate and to seek concessions and to give concessions and to compromise. All of those things are part of a negotiation, but still what you have to remember in the negotiation is you always have to remember what your goal is, what your desired outcome. You're always still wanting to do better than your best alternative to not getting an agreement, right? So, think of some things. We can come up with as many examples as you want, but, you go to a flea market and you have a price that you want to pay for a particular item, and you think, well, this is exactly what my outcome is. This is what I want to pay. You might not be willing to concede anymore. You might not be willing to compromise anymore. And so one option would be, oh, this is what's marked on it, so I'm going to forego what I want rather than entering into a negotiation and seeing if I can convince them to sell me the item for what I want it to be. And if you start to take perspective and you start to think about things, first of all, you've already gained your BATNA, but you also want to then turn around and say, well, how could I influence them? What is their perspective? Well, one of the things I could think about is they don't want to put this item back on the truck and take it home, right? And one of the other things I should think about is, if I don't make an offer, if I don't enter into a negotiation, if I don't try to barter that or negotiate them down, horse trade them down, I guess, the next person who comes along might not offer as good a deal as I'm willing to offer. So, there are times when you're going to want to try to use your influence to get the deal that you want, also recognizing that it may be the deal that the other side needs, whether they recognize it or not. Think about a physician in a situation where, again, they're dealing with a patient who doesn't want to take a particular medication, doesn't want to go into the hospital, doesn't want to have surgery, and they can come up with all sorts of very empathetic stories, I'm sure. My father went into the hospital when I was 12 years old, and he was going in for surgery, and the physician told him that it wouldn't be any big deal, and he got a complication, or a complication occurred and he died, and I don't want to have that happen to me, and my I have 3 young children or 2 young children, and I don't want them to go in there and have that happen and they lose their father. And so what could a physician do? A physician could say, well, okay, I can empathize with that. I hear your emotion. So, let's not pursue what I think is in your best interest. Let's not pursue the deal or the goal that I think is the right outcome here. So instead you try to gain more perspective. You try to get, you try to empathize, and you recognize the emotional attachment that they may have to the decision, but that shouldn't stop you from trying to get the outcome, or trying to stop the physician or the healthcare provider from trying to get the decision or the deal that they think is the right one to get. In a medical malpractice case, if I'm dealing with a patient and a case, and I feel that if we go to trial, we're going to win the case. There's always risk. So you never know what the outcome is. But if I feel fairly confident based on my experience and training that if I try this case and win it, but yet there was a decision to make to try at least to resolve the case to make a settlement offer of some amount of money, my job is to gain perspective and try to empathize, and then use that to get the other side to get to a negotiated agreement, to a deal that I want. But in my mind, when I'm doing this, it's also a deal that's in their best interest. And if I don't try to persuade them, and there's been times more so in the past, when I was a younger attorney, somebody would call up and we'd have a discussion, and they would make a demand for a settlement, and they'd say, we want, a certain amount of money. And rather than trying to negotiate with them or influence them to change their perspective, I would simply say, well, we're not going to be able to get to that amount of money. And so our only alternative at this point is to go to trial. Now, in those circumstances, if we try the case and I'm successful, my failure to try to negotiate with them didn't help in that circumstance, because they left or exited out, I guess, of the whole case with no money. There was no favorable resolution in any way. It was all, I win, or the physician or healthcare provider won, and they lost. Whereas, by trying to influence and trying to use perspective and trying to use, empathy, if I can then influence them to take a settlement that I think is what's in our best interest and the best alternative, or we're better than our BATNA, and they're willing, and I can get them to accept it, that's also good for them, because the potential outcome is nothing. So that's where I'm trying to be influential. If a business owner who's developed the business and is an emotional connection to the business because they put in so much sweat equity, overvalues that business, and I'm willing to pay more value than it's been estimated, or the accountants have said is the fair market value, I'm willing to pay something more than that. Well, if I don't try to gain the perspective and then use my skills to influence and get the owner to sell the business, and maybe I would, use other factors like keeping them involved, things of that nature. If I simply walk away understanding, gee, I recognize why they have an emotional attachment and why they want X number of dollars for the business, even though it's above fair market value. If I walk away from that deal and I don't try to influence them, it doesn't help me to try to get the outcome, but it may also not help them because there may be nobody else who comes along willing to make the same offer that I was willing to make. So, using these skills, using empathy and perspective taking is to get the deal that you want, but you also believe, while influence the other, that it's a good deal for them. And that's why it's not manipulation. And so when we use this, when we use perspective taking and we use empathy, what the first time or the first way in which we use it as we're creating our BATNA, or we may have created our BATNA, but now we're in the negotiation and we're testing our BATNA to see if the conclusions or the goal that we seek is actually right. And we continue to do this, because we always want to be open to the concept of being wrong. Because if our goal or how we come to our BATNA is wrong, then that doesn't help us, right? We've got misconceptions ourselves, and we may never get the deal, or we'll never meet our goal. But also, however, if you're open to the concept of being wrong, and you listen and you hear and you investigate, and then you realize that you're not wrong, that should give you the confidence to know when you're right, and that your goal is right, and that you have every right to try to pursue your BATNA, or pursue something that is better than your BATNA. So, pictured here is Alice Stewart. Alice Stewart was a physician. I'll talk about her in another lecture, but essentially she was a physician in the 50s, and she did an epidemiological study and derived the conclusion that women who are in pregnancy and exposed to diagnostic X-ray, their children had a very significant increased risk of childhood cancer. And so those conclusions were resisted by many in the medical community. And so she had to continue to try to influence others to accept them, and in so doing, she continually had to come to her conclusions, back up her conclusions, support her conclusions, and she had somebody who she hired whose job was to challenge every conclusion she came to, and that's where she came to the concept that if you're open to being wrong, then you should have all the confidence to know when you're right. Once you've developed your BATNA, and in addition to developing your BATNA, perspective taking and empathy is used to try to determine what the perspective of your opposing side is, obviously. So in this famous New Yorker cover from the 1970s, we see the perspective of a New Yorker from a New Yorker standing on 9th Avenue. So if you were going to suggest that, they should buy property, in New Jersey or beyond, this is potentially, the perspective that you have to consider very skewed, and for them to think of outside of or beyond the Hudson River, is going to take some influencing, because it's all, a much more flatter, less visual ability for them, or less ability for them to visualize, beyond the Hudson River. So again, trying to understand, gain perspective, see what obstacles you're up against, and then be able to challenge those obstacles or those misconceptions is important. Or the other reason for taking perspective is just to find out when somebody may be wrong, as I've mentioned earlier. So using the same cover, for instance. Now we have a cover from Mad Magazine who used the New Yorker cover but changed it because Google Maps, or not Google Maps, Apple Maps had just come out with their application, and it was continuously being wrong. And so they, basically in this one put the Sea of Galilee where the Hudson River was. And so, again, using sort of perspective taking, looking at trying to identify where someone might be right and correcting the error, now whatever conclusion they's come by, has to be altered because it's based on misconceived logic or incorrect facts. So using the relational model, leadership model in negotiation means getting the deal that you want by influencing others, right? And we're using these relational skills, including empathy, perspective taking, one, to make the other side feel empowered, to keep them, feeling in a process of inclusiveness, that there is purpose to the discussion, the dialogue, that you're listening to them, and you're always, again, open to the concept of being wrong, but despite including them in the dialogue, despite empowering them to try to change the process, you are not necessarily changing your BATNA or compromising or foregoing what you want simply because you hear their perspective, or simply because you see or feel the emotional connection they have with it. Right? You're not going to give up what you want unless you realize that you've come to your BATNA, in a misconceived way. But if you haven't come to that conclusion, you'll still use these skills, but it's to influence the other side as to why this is a deal or why this is an outcome that's good for them too. And, it's all about creating trust, right? Relational leadership means creating trust. And so as we do this, the thing to keep in mind is a quote from Maya Angelou, which is, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel." So now what we're going to do is we're going to watch a little video that I think emphasizes the point that first, and oftentimes, in a negotiation or in a discussion, you really have to try to gain trust and empathize first, so that you can ultimately try to influence the situation.
And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. All of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just...
Don't...
So what was well exemplified by that video is that no matter how much the person may have a false perception, or they may be suffering under some, delusion, if you will, about what the process is really is really about, or what the conflict is really about, or what the negotiation is really about. As you know from your own experiences, we've all felt this way, that before you can trust the other side, or you can place trust, you have to feel as though they understand where you're coming from, that you have to, that you empathize with them, that you know what they're going through. Okay. And no matter how wrong their perception of the situation is, until you gain that trust and you sort of empower them to, to be able to put their trust in you, you're not going to get very far in a negotiation, as that gentleman found out. So, when we think of coming to, the skills and why they're needed in a negotiation, again, you need to be able to see the world as others see it. This requires putting, our preconceptions and emotions aside to see the situation through the eyes of the other side. So, that gentleman, who perhaps didn't even, for obvious reasons, may not have done it even very well at the end, but tried to do it, is he couldn't experience the world as she was experiencing it. But again, presumably, we'll never have that kind of situation, where we have such a skewed reality where you're trying to negotiate with the other side. But again, you can deal with people and deal with situations and have to negotiate with people who are poor negotiators and who have some pretty skewed realities. So it may be that they may not have a nail sticking out of their head, but they may have some sort of a similar kind of misconception. So still need to be non-judgmental. Judgment pertaining to the other side's situation undermines their experience, and it prevents us from understanding the emotional experience caused by the situation. And to understand another person's feelings, it requires, certainly a sufficient amount of emotional intelligence to step outside of ourselves and focus on the other side. Then we need to communicate our understanding of that person's feelings back to them through reframing, and then empowering the other side, creating the capacity to impact the process. So, stepping back for a moment. So even in that video that we just watched, the gentleman, potentially, if this was a real negotiation, could have stepped back and, basically asked questions and created the opportunity for her to, explain why what she's experiencing and the difficulties she's having isn't about the nail. And then once you get that full reality, you start to influence the other side. So you empower them, you create the capacity to impact the process, you let them try to put their point of view out there, and you listen carefully, you try to focus on it, and then you start the process of influence once you've done that. Objectively, throughout this process, throughout the negotiation, you need to evaluate your goals and advocate for yourself in a way that is positive and proactive. The purpose of the analysis is to help the parties make informed decisions about possible options for resolution. So again, you need to, and we'll be talking about assertive in the not too distant future, then you've got to be able to effectively communicate your position, explain the rationale, and listen to the response, right? So it's a back and forth. It's a communicate, explain, assert, then take perspective by listening to the response. Develop and, try to empathize with the response that you get. Here, make sure that there's nothing new that challenges your equation for how you came up with your goal and how you came up with your desired outcome. And then, so again, being wrong or being open to being wrong in order to know that you are right. So overall, again, objective evaluation of ourselves, recognizing our blind spots, staying aware, and by doing that, obviously, this allows you to listen, gain the perspective, remain flexible throughout, objectively evaluate and reevaluate your BATNA and your WATNA, worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. Oftentimes that is something we need to consider when we're in a negotiation. And then you need to maintain assertiveness of your position and not letting empathy sort of evolve into sympathy, and not letting empathy or the emotions prevent you from asserting to get your best, the goal that you want or the outcome you want, and so that instead you compromise lower than your BATNA, you concede lower than your BATNA, or alternatively you forego trying to get a deal altogether. And so this is how I want you to think about using perspective taking and empathy in order to influence, the outcome of a negotiation or the outcome or resolving a conflict in which you're involved. All right. Good luck as we continue to walk through the materials, and I'll be posting another lecture at some point next week. Thanks so much.